We've reached kind of the pinnacle of our diversity in plants, which are the flowering plants. The most specialized, they often rely on mutualistic relationships and have a highly developed fertilization and seed development. All right, so the Phylum Magnoliophyta are the flowering plants, and they we'll talk about them and their development of gametophytes, their pollination, their fertilization, and development of the seed. A couple of variations of fertilization called apomixis and parthenocarpy. And finally, trends of specialization and classification. So we'll talk about specialization and classification of flowering plants and a little bit about pollination. So angiosperms then are the flowering plants. They have seeds enclosed in a carpel that resembles a leaf that has folded over and fused at the margin. So the carpel is contains the egg, the female reproductive parts, the megasporocyte, and is fertilized in the process of pollination. The pistil is composed of a single carpel, or it can have two or more united carpels. And the seed develops from the ovule, which is the diploid part, within the carpel. And then the ovary becomes a fruit, becomes the fleshy part of the fruit. Angiosperms are mostly divided into two large classes, are Magnoliophyta, which are the dicots, and the Liliophyta, which are the monocots. And we talked about the differences between the two, so we won't go over those. And a flower is simply a modified stem with modified leaves, and the different whorls are the different modified leaves. So the flowering plants are heterosporous, which means they produce two different types of gametophytes, and that means they have a life cycle where they have two different haploid and diploid parts. And the sporophyte, the diploid organism, is the dominant type. In fact, the gametophyte is very reduced and is wholly, and the female gametophyte is wholly enclosed within the sporophyte tissue. And it only has a few cells. Okay. At maturity, the male gametophyte consists of the pollen grain, and it has 3 nuclei, so also very reduced and very small. So the development of gametophytes, we'll start with the female reproductive megasporocyte. So the diploid megasporocyte differentiates into the structure called an ovule. The ovule undergoes meiosis and produces 4 haploid megaspores. So this is kind of where we're picking up on this. Only one of them survives, kind of like in the gymnosperms. And the remaining cell enlarges, and then also its nuclei divides and produces 8 nuclei. Those 8 nuclei then, we'll talk about them in a minute. The outer 2 layers then of the ovule differentiate into the integument, which eventually becomes the seed coat, again similar to gymnosperms. And it has one opening where the pollen tube will insert, and that is the micropyle. So again, back to our female gametophyte, we had the 8 nuclei. What they do is they form 2 groups of 4, and one nucleus from each of the 4 meets in the middle to form this central cell. And the cell walls form around the other remaining 6 nuclei. The egg is 1. The 2 synergids are closest to the micropyle. And then 3 antipodals, 6, 7, and 8. All right, so here's the central nuclei. And you can only see 2 antipodals here. A third one is behind it. So the female gametophyte then is called the megagametophyte, or the embryo sac, and it has those 8 nuclei and 7 cells because 2 of them fuse together. All right, the male gametophyte forms or takes place in the anthers, which are 4 patches, okay, corresponding to pollen sacs of microsporocyte cells. Okay, they go through some important changes first by dividing by, or the microspores divide by mitosis to form a small generative cell inside the larger tube cells. So you have 2 cells now, one inside of the other. The nucleus of the tube cell is called the vegetative nucleus. And then the members of each quartet of microspores then separate. And here's a pollen grain. Okay, so with our microspores, our pollen grains, and our ovule differentiating into our microsporocyte, you are then ready for fertilization, which takes place through a process called pollination. So pollen somehow is transferred then to the stigma of the female reproductive parts. Sometimes this pollen might be from the same flower, which would be self-pollination. Other times, however, it has to be from a different flower. There's ways to recognize when you have your own pollen. Fertilization then occurs through pollen providing a pollen tube and sperms then inserting into the micropyle. Pollination occurs, so pollen going from the anther to the stigma occurs through mutual associations by insects or by wind or by water or sometimes just gravity falling down into the pollen. So after pollination, further development of the male gametophyte may not take place unless a pollen grain, again, is from a different species or even from a different variety, to ensure that you have some variation in your reproduction. Pollen tube then grows between the cells of the stigma and style until it reaches the micropyle. And the vegetative nucleus stays at the tip of the pollen, up here, while the generative cell lags behind and divides into 2 sperms. Okay, and then the pollen tube enters the female gametophyte at the micropyle, destroys the synergids, and in the process discharges the sperm. So 2 sperm. One of the sperms. All right, so here is a mature pollen grain with its pollen tube, the vegetative nucleus, and the 2 sperm cells. Okay. Now, one of the sperm unites with the egg, forming a zygote and then an embryo. The other sperm unites with the central cell nuclei. Remember that had 2 nuclei? So it now has 3 nuclei once it's fertilized, and it's a triploid tissue, which is called the endosperm. The endosperm provides nutrition for the embryo, but only after it is fertilized. If it's not fertilized, then it doesn't provide the nutrition. It becomes an extensive part of the seed in a lot of the monocots, such as corns and grasses, and that's what we eat. That's the nutritious part of corn and rice. The endosperm is then absorbed into cotyledons in most dicots, which are the beginning of the growth. The first leaves are the cotyledons. The ovule becomes the seed, the ovary matures into a fruit, and the integuments harden into the seed coat. Okay, so here are some of the flowers in our flowering plants. We'll talk about a couple of these. So, the lily or female gametophyte development, again, you start with one megasporocyte, which megaspore, which goes through meiosis and forms 4 megasporocytes. 3 of those degenerate, and then you have 1 megasporocyte remaining. Its nuclei divide until it has 8 nuclei. 2 of them form the central nuclei. 1 of them forms an egg, and 2 of those form the synergids, and then 3 of those are on the other side, the antipodals. Okay, so you can see under the microscope the different, by counting the number of nuclei, you can know which stage it's in here. There are other ways if fertilization cannot take place, if pollination cannot take place to reproduce. Apomixis is one of those processes. It's where you do not have fusion of gametes, you don't have sperm and egg coming together, but you can still form the same process. An embryo is formed by a diploid nutritive cell or another diploid cell of the ovule instead of from the zygote. So you're creating a seed, but it's not from sperm, it's from the same female gametophyte structure. Parthenocarpy then is another process where a fruit develops, but there's no seed. The egg is unfertilized or is infertile, which results in seedless fruits. So navel oranges and bananas, they have unfertilized fruits. Oops, sorry. All right, so how do we classify these? Well, we classify them usually according to their specialized parts. Historically, they were classified for out of convenience, so which looked the most similar. Modern botanists group them according to natural relationships and evolution and DNA similarities. The fossil record suggests that the first flowering plants were on the Earth 160 million years ago during the late Jurassic, and they continued to develop and diversify throughout the Cretaceous and Cenozoic. They are the dominant plants today, the most abundant, most diverse. All right, so some of the specializations we talked about before. We have the pistil forming from leaf-like structure with ovules along the margins, and that is called the carpel. And so some pistils can have one carpel, and some of them can have multiple carpels. If it's one carpel, then it's a simple pistil. If it has multiple carpels fused together, then it's a compound pistil. So separate carpels of primitive flowers fused together to form this compound pistil. The ovary can have different placement, or depending on where it is compared to your anther and other flowering parts such as petals and sepals. So an inferior ovary, the ovary is below the flower parts, so that the stamens and the petals and sepals would be on top of the ovary. The superior, there's two different types. Hypogynous means it's below, the flowering parts are below the ovary, and then perigynous means it's kind of somewhere in the middle. All right, a complete flower has all the reproductive parts: a calyx, corolla, stamens, and pistil. So an incomplete flower has one of those arrangements missing. So it could have a corolla missing, or it could have petals missing, or it could have stamens or ovaries missing. A perfect flower has both stamens and pistil present, and an imperfect flower has either stamens or pistil missing. So imperfect flowers are also incomplete. Perfect flowers are complete if they have a calyx and corolla, but you can have a perfect flower that is also incomplete. Here are a couple flowers. Here's an inferior ovary. The flowering parts are above the ovaries. This is inferior. And it has a male and female flower. So this is a monoecious species. These are incomplete flowers, and they're also imperfect. Okay, so this one has stamens, and this one has the pistil. Dioecious plants are perfect, okay, and for the most part you're going to be complete, but some of them can be incomplete. All right, primitive flowers are mostly radial symmetry, meaning you cut them in half in any way, and you would form two equal halves, and this is called regular. Their flowering parts are generally very numerous, so they have lots of stamens, they have lots of pistils, and they are not fused to each other, so they're all a little bit separate. And they also have very simple leaves. Okay, more advanced flowers, specialized flowers, have fewer flower parts, so are generally sometimes incomplete. Their spiral arrangements are compressed to whorls, and then they may have very specialized flower petals, which makes them bilaterally symmetrical. So here's a pea flower, here's an orchid, and they are also have fused, you may have stamens and petals fused together, or different arrangements, carpels and sepals and petals can also be fused together, and so it's just become more specialized and more complicated. They generally also have an inferior ovary. So pollinators have co-evolved with plants, many of the flowering plants. These flowering plants depend on insects or other things to transfer the pollen from one flower to another. There's 20,000 bee species which are pollinators, and in bee pollinated flowers they're generally very bright, and they are also under UV light generally have some sort of marking pattern. Bees can see in the UV spectrum, so they would see this flower different than we would. Okay, and that's just going to provide them, a little better marking for where to find honey, which is where the pollen would also be. You have beetle-pollinated flowers. These aren't going to be very visually stunning because bees can't really see very well. And they'll have more of a effervescent attractant to them, so they'll smell like yeast or spice or fruity. And some don't even secrete nectar, but they can eat pollen. So if you produce enough pollen where they eat some of it and some of it gets on the beetle, and the beetle goes to another plant and pollinates it that way. Fly-pollinated species are going to do things to attract flies. So they're going to smell and look kind of like rotten meat. So these are two fly-pollinating plants here. Butterfly and moth-pollinated flowers usually have to have this pollen tube to allow for the butterfly to get the nectar out of it with its long proboscis. For night-flying moths, they need something that's visually going to stand out, so very white, bright, or yellow colored flowers. These are often very colorful, so a range of colors, red, blue, or yellow, or orange for many butterflies. Bird-pollinated flowers are often bright red or yellow, and they don't really have much of an odor because birds can't really smell very well, but very, very bright and have lots of nectar to provide the energy needed for the bird. And then they have long floral tubes, and generally the birds have long beaks, so they go in there and get pollen on their face. There are also bat-pollinated flowers. They're primarily in the tropics where bats are very abundant. They open at night when bats are flying around. Generally dull in color because, again, it's dark, so you can't really see it, but have lots of surface areas be very large, so the bats can land on it, stick their head in it, get pollen all over themselves, and then move on to the next one. So one very interesting flower is also, some of them have mimics. So here's an orchid that has what looks like it looks like a female insect, and so a bee or wasp will come and try to mate with it, and then they'll get pollen all over them, and then they'll go and try to mate with another one, and they'll get pollinated that way. So pretty interesting way of kind of tricking their pollinator to get pollen all over them. Okay, that's it.